In the room. I come to this field through financial management, and given the economic firepower here, I'm a little reluctant to proceed. Particularly, you'll think I'm talking about fiction, but consider me one of the comic interludes in the Shakespearean tragedy. You know, serious stuff, and then Shakespeare mixes it up. And the second caveat is that I'm not responsible for the title and therefore not for the content. This title was assigned to me, so I'm making no forecast with respect to the future development of the Indian economy. I'm not forecasting a downturn. In fact, I can't recall in my more than a half century looking at government finances and budgets a single country that was growing that forecast a future recession. It simply doesn't happen. So I will talk about the topic that was assigned to me. Does this work? No. I'll actually begin with my conclusion, and that is two conclusions actually. First of all, the problem with stabilizers is not how they work during the bad times, but how they fail to work during the good times. And that is the simple notion that you have stabilizers, whether they're discretionary or automatic, and they're supposed to do their work when the economy is weak, but when the economy is strong, they don't exercise constraint. Of course, that's what you'll call a pro-cyclical bias. And consequently, if you want to look at the impact of fiscal rules, I think the time to look at it is when the economy is strong rather than when it's weak. And the second general conclusion I would have is that fiscal rules, the very existence of fiscal rules, represents, as certainly the first generation of fiscal rules, a vote of no confidence in stabilization. That's what it was. Keep in mind that fiscal rules were established by politicians. Their fingerprints are on it, and so we may have economic doctrine in support of it, but it was political leaders who recognized the problems of stabilization. Okay. Now, the fiscal crisis was not global, but it has impacted, as I believe almost all of us would agree, on stabilization policy in emerging and developing countries, even though the first impact was on the advanced countries. It was settled for so many decades, and I guess it's still settled in the minds of some people like Paul Krugman that automatic stabilizers promote economic recovery, even though they enlarge fiscal deficits. That deficits in good times represent a policy position of government that advances society toward recovery. Okay. That was settled doctrine. Okay. And we recognize also that these stabilizers work principally on the revenue side of the ledger rather than expenditures, much more weakly on expenditure. But we welcome stabilizers. We welcome the enlargement of deficits. And we thought that a key advantage of stabilizers was they fade away when the economy recovers, thereby doing little or no damage to the country's long-term fiscal position. That was then. Now, I think there's growing recognition that the stabilizers leave the imprint on future budgets for many, many years into the future. The stabilizer may fade away as revenues grow and counter-cyclical expenditure shrink, but the buildup of debt, and which translates also into future larger deficits, just to service that debt, doesn't go away. Okay. And we know also that governments, under this doctrine, did not rely only on automatic stabilizers, but on discretionary stimulus as well. Discretionary stimulus was good, not only because it moved toward recovery, but because it did what politicians wanted to do, and that is reduce taxes and increase expenditures. And the next to the last bullet on the screen is something which is taken for granted in the literature, that governments regarded it more important to balance the economy, even at the price of unbalancing the budget. However, the emphasis on austerity, wow, I mentioned that word. I've been listening to 6 hours thus far, and austerity has not been mentioned. This is the first time that that dirty word has appeared in the room, austerity. Wash my mouth out. Seriously, we cannot talk about fiscal rules without recognizing the fact that we're in an age of austerity, whether it's appropriate or not appropriate. And it's not only in a country like Greece or Ireland and some other heavily impacted countries. My own country, the United States, we will have, since the last 5 years, a shrinkage of the fiscal deficit by 3/4, from above 10% of GDP to approximately an estimated now 2.5% of GDP, in the face of still very high unemployment in the United States, although I would recognize much lower than it was in the official numbers, but hidden unemployment in the United States is still very, very large. The armies of the unemployed or discouraged workers or part-time workers who can't afford full-time work, or people who use a smoke screen that I'm self-employed because they're trying to. Despite that, the United States is in a heavy period of austerity. In fact, mention was made earlier today of the fiscal stimulus package in the first year of the Obama presidency. That was such a mild stimulus. Most of the money went to state and local governments. But during the heat of the downturn, American state and local governments reduced their public sector headcount by hundreds of thousands of people. That was austerity at work. So we must understand why austerity. It actually speaks to the fact that we no longer have the same confidence in automatic and discretionary stabilizers, which sets the stage for the importance of fiscal rules. And so I titled this screen Fiscal Rules versus Economic Stabilizers, although listening to the discussion this morning, I heard a heavy dose of analysis that claimed that, and properly so, according to the evidence that was presented, that rules are fiscal stabilizers, economic stabilizers. It should be evident that if you're preparing a budget during a period that you believe that stabilizing the economy is utmost, that the budget itself and its fiscal outturns are hostage to the performance of the economy, which means during a long stretch after World War II in advanced countries, a government would table a budget. The budget would indicate what the aggregates would be. But those aggregates entirely were elastic, they were fluid, they were tentative, and they were known only effectively in hindsight after the fiscal period had closed. So the government was prepared to adjust those, allow adjustment of those fiscal aggregates in response to changes in economic conditions. Okay. There were no preset limits, only weak limits, and aggregate expenditure deficits or public debt. This was quite important. And as many of you know, while early in the post-war period, the dependence of the budget on the economy was largely counter-cyclical. By 20 or 30 years after World War II, by the 70s or 80s, the purpose was somewhat different. Not so much stabilization, but closing or narrowing the output gap that was mentioned this morning. Okay. That was a tremendous shift in economic and budget management in advanced countries. Okay. So therefore, deficits and excessive budget orders were welcome as measures of stabilization policy at work. Okay. So then we have the advent of fiscal rules. Okay. And they didn't just happen. It just wasn't the case that one country or one region like the EU decided that they needed fiscal rules. there was a change in sentiment. Okay? And if you think about it, we look back at first generation rules and we ask ourselves, how clumsy could they have been? How stupid could their architects have been? How could they ignored the cyclical vicissitudes in the economy? They were fixed. 3% GDP, 60% debt level. Yes, there were a few countries, Switzerland, Chile come to mind, as countries which built in a structural element into their fiscal rules. But the first generation rules were overwhelmingly fixed. They were set in stone, ignoring changes in economic policy. Okay? And they could be effective, therefore, only to the extent that they constrain or disable the automatic stabilizers. They could not work otherwise. It's true that the demobilization of automatic stabilizers was implied rather than stated. I don't recall reading a document that said automatic stabilizers should be disabled. They do more harm than good. Okay? But the effect was so transparent and so inevitable. And inevitable, of course, only if fiscal rules would do their intended job. Okay? And of course, that's not what happened, because the pro-cyclical bias of fiscal rules doomed them. Now, I wrote these lines before I listened to this morning's presentations, which claimed considerable effectiveness in fiscal rules. Not only you, but a few people. And so I have to sweat it out, so to speak. And I'll sweat it out this way. Whenever you have a rule, whether it's a fiscal rule or any other rule, you can look at it in one of two ways. Was it breached, or was it effective? It turns out that the answer to both of those questions can be yes at the same time. A fiscal rule can be violated, it doesn't work, and yet it can be constrictive. Okay. And that's exactly what happened. They were breached. So if you look at Germany, France, during the pre-global crisis period, they violated the rules. And it made a difference. Look at France and Italy today, which are on the dock in Brussels for violating the new fiscal compact. Yes, they are in breach of the fiscal contract, but I'm certain that the budgets that they're about to present to the Parliament in what's called the European semester, they must present the budget to the EC in advance. Okay? I'm sure that their budgets would be more expansive if there were no fiscal rules, no fiscal compact in place. Okay. So as I say in the last thing over here, violations were common. They did have a constraining impact in quite a few developed countries. Okay. Okay. But we generally regarded stabilization policy after World War II as successful, but only as long as downturns were short and shallow and were followed by robust growth. And this was a period for a long period of time. It wasn't a growth of 6% or 7.5% or 10%, as you see in this part of the world sometimes. I'm assuming you can believe the figures always, but it's another matter. But there were 3, 4, 5% a year growth, which in an advanced economy is doing quite well. And more importantly, when the growth was interrupted, the interruption was short, it was followed by recovery, and the trough, that is the loss in output and the rise in unemployment, was relatively modest. Okay. So we regarded stabilization policy as in the first quarter century, approximately after the World War, as being successful. Okay. But then, and now we're coming to the era of fiscal rules, the slowdown of growth impelled many countries to reconsider these policies. I'm going through what happened. Why fiscal rules? Okay. Begin with a simple statistic in the OECD countries, and that is that aggregate expenditure, average across the OECD community, was 20 percentage points higher as a share of GDP at the end of the century than it was in 1960, the year that OECD was established. In fact, most of that growth occurred between 1960 and 1980 or so. 20 percentage points average across the community. Keep in mind as well that this was a period of strong growth in this community. So the denominator was growing. It wasn't simply that spending grew 20 percentage points. Overall, it grew as a share of the economy. These elevated expenditures were partly financed by rising tax burdens. But as the century neared a close, the 20th century neared a close, it became increasingly difficult in OECD countries, advanced countries, to raise taxes further. And in fact, quite a few countries moved in the opposite direction to reduce the aggregate tax burden. So public debt escalated, spurring concern as to long-term sustainability of public finance. You began to have, near the end of the century, something which was simply an academic exercise before then, and that is governments looking well into the future, 30 or 50 years into the future. You didn't see that in 1960, 1970, 1980. Okay? You began to see near the end of the century, governments asking the question, yes, we can pay the bills now, can we pay them 30 or 40 years hence? Okay? And these concerns were stimulated by aging populations and the embedded long-term pension and healthcare costs. But most importantly, we came to recognize that stabilization policy had a built-in bias. Governments spent more money during downturns to boost the economy, and they spent more money in good times than upturns because they had more money to spend. If you think about it, you spend more when the economy is good, you spend more when the economy is bad, the bottom line is going to show this 20 percentage point growth rate. And then the final entry on the screen, you had what we can call sticky expenditures. Expenditures which have their own dynamic, their own rationale. They really are not well controlled by government. In India, apparently a lot of them are embedded in subsidies. In advanced countries, embedded in transfers, in income transfers. And the budget became hostage not only to the performance of the economy, but became hostage to other developments, the age structure of the population, the rate of inflation, and other measures which drove these sticky expenditures. So now we move to, so these concerns as the 20th century neared a close gave rise to fiscal rules. We saw a presentation this morning how rapidly they spread across the world. And most first-generation rules covered a single fiscal year, not the medium term or an economic cycle. And let me just stop over here and reinforce what several presenters mentioned this morning, and that is, whatever your position is on fiscal rules, they work at all, or certainly work better, if they embedded in medium-term frameworks. That's very important to understand. And a fiscal rule that is limited to a single year is as myopic as a budget which is limited to a single year, has the same defects. Okay? So many countries established medium-term frameworks, but those didn't work well either. Think about what a medium-term framework does, and I think India should consider this. It can actually do damage to countries' fiscal position if it's not well managed. Okay? A medium-term framework sets levels for the medium term, expenditure levels, 3 to 5 years ahead. We shall spend so much this year, so much next year, so much the third year. And then you roll the budget, roll the medium-term framework over next year. When you come to year 2, which now becomes the budget year, a year hence, right? Is that constraint you establish a ceiling or a floor? You know what I'm talking about? In most countries, it's a floor. Not F-L-A-W, but that's true also, but F-L-O-O-R. It becomes the starting point for building the next budget. You intended it a year ago as a constraint on next year's budget. It has exactly the opposite effect if a fiscal constraint, if a medium term framework is not well managed. Now, fiscal rules have been undermined in some countries by going to economic forecasts, which, as was mentioned this morning, it becomes one of the powerful justifications for independent fiscal councils. And as was amply argued this morning, that the establishment of these councils has led to much more prudent fiscal forecast, economic forecast than in the past. But fiscal rules are not self-enforcing. They require political commitment to curtail spending demands and pressure for relief. And here's where fiscal rules went astray. During good times, they were used to justify additional spending. Imagine you are in a EU country, and you have a 3% of GDP deficit limit, and the economy is growing. What does that tell you? You can spend more, provided you're within 3% deficit. That scrolls back to what I said earlier, that the test of fiscal rules must always be in the good times, not in the first generation fiscal rules invited tricks, ploys that hid contingent liabilities, other risks, shifted expenditures to future fiscal periods, captured one-off income from sale of public assets, raided cash balances of state enterprises. All of these were done in the name of fiscal prudence. Okay. I might say at the end that it's kind of interesting. One of the findings about fiscal rules is that some scholars make a distinction between fixed rules and fiscal responsibility procedures. A fiscal responsibility procedure enables the government of the day to establish the fiscal targets for the period immediately ahead. In contrast to a fixed rule where the government's hands are tied. Okay. It turns out, surprisingly at first glance, but not surprisingly if you think it over, that the more elastic, flexible fiscal responsibility procedures yielded better results than the fixed fiscal rules. And the reason they yielded better results is they were backed by political commitment, which is necessary for rules to work in the first place. So now we come to that dirty word I mentioned earlier, why austerity? Why should we have next generation fiscal rules if the first generation had all those problems? Okay. And as I said earlier, even when they fail, they often leave a legacy of austerity, etc. In the aftermath of crisis, numerous OECD countries have adopted austere policies despite very high unemployment. Some have adopted them voluntarily, like the UK, the United States. Others have been compelled by austerity, by outside pressures. But we're now in a transition point, I believe. Not in the UK, I might say, and maybe not in the United States, but in certain European countries, to ease the grip of austerity in national budgets and return to stimulus. So now let's shift to the developing world. And it turns out that while austerity is new to developed country, it's been your next door neighbor in developing countries for a very long period of time. And because it's been different. And many of these countries actually have feeble built-in stabilizers. Automatic stabilizers don't work for them. Why? Because they mobilize very few revenues. The revenues derived from commodity prices, for example, rather from income taxation. And they have very, very modest income supports. So in developing countries for decades, downturns favored expenditure cuts, especially when terms of trade deteriorated, interest rates were high, and the country had, as often in the case in developing countries, chronic current account imbalances. And this led to a problem which I must call attention to, and that is the different behavioral responses of advanced countries and developing countries to economic downturns. In affluent countries, they enlarged their deficits when the economy was weak. Low-income countries were pressured to curtail deficits by shrinking public expenditure, and in some cases by raising taxation. And I can tell you as a teacher, I teach at a university for many years, how maybe uninformed but enraged my students were by what they regarded as a double standard. They couldn't understand it. Why is it that in developed countries, particularly the United States, when a deficit appeared, we said spend more, tax less, borrow more, and the developing countries were required to take a rather different medicine. I tried to explain to my students, not always successfully, that it wasn't the IMF, it wasn't the IMF, it wasn't the World Bank, it was capital markets. Money migrates to developed countries, particularly the United States, when it needs more. Consider how different developed countries would have been if they had difficulty financing their fiscal deficits. The secret of stabilization policy is not simply that they had automatic stabilizers, but that it was so easy for them to cover the deficit, to finance it. If they couldn't do it internally, as Japan did, they did it through external borrowing. No difficulty. And the situation was so very different in low-income countries, because rather than capital migrating to them, capital fled to them, from them. And so you have a ruble crisis, you have a peso crisis, you have a baht crisis, if I remember from East Asia in the late 1990s, as hot capital flees from the country. It's interesting. Some developed countries are now getting the bit of fiscal medicine that once was the fiscal fate of less fortunate countries. So let's now turn to stabilizers again. High unemployment, low or no growth, today's low interest rates, the risk of deflation speak to the legitimacy of and perhaps the need for stimulative policies. Seriously. And we're talking about both automatic and discretionary responses to economic weakness. So the real problem, how do you meld together this need for stimulus today with fiscal discipline? That's important, and therefore care must be taken to ensure that fiscal effects of stimulus fade away as growth resumes. The real problem in some countries that need stimulus today is the after effects of the stimulus. If you're not careful about it, it will leave its imprint, as I argued earlier, on future budgets. In other words, stabilization must be truly counter-cyclical, something which was not the case in the past. I know it's hard to say that stabilization is pro-cyclical, but my argument is that's exactly what it was, because you spent more in both circumstances. Okay. And this will require next generation rules that enforce fiscal discipline during good economic times. And it's too early to assess whether these next generation rules, such as the EU's fiscal compact, will work. But to tell you the truth, it's not promising. Let me conclude by looking at emerging market countries. And here, if you look at the first bullet, it immediately tells you that there are a number of countries, and I believe India included, which have a real problem. As a country develops, there's a well-known relationship between public expenditure and the state of development. And that is, in early stages of development, countries' public expenditure share of GDP is relatively modest.
and that share rises as the economy expands and public well-being improves. And how that dynamic works is quite simple. Governments expand income supports, in larger capacity, stabilize economic conditions, etc. Okay? But BRIC countries, and as you know, brick by brick India has been included in that, have large public sectors. They have little room for growth in relative expenditures as their economies expand. That should be expand, not expand. Maybe expand is a better word. But seriously, countries, you tell me if the fourth bullet on this page fits India. Countries that have high growth and high deficits, for example, 6% growth and 6% deficits, have little margin for stabilization. This is really a problem for them. Countries dependent on natural resources, this doesn't particularly apply to India, do well to promote stabilization through reserve funds such as Chile and Norway have used. Okay. I wrote this before I heard the statement of the chair from the Expenditure Committee, which is soon to report. Stabilization policy would still include politically difficult expenditure cuts, particularly curtailing subsidies, reducing the public service headcount, and better targeting transfers. And finally, fiscal responsibility frameworks over the medium term, which allow the government to set targets through its fiscal machinery and budget processes, probably are better fit for emerging countries than fixed fiscal rules.